Everyone, welcome to the January 2022 Subawards Subcommittee. My name is Kevin Ritchie. I work at Harvard Medical School. I'm one of the co-chairs, and my fellow co-chairs can just pop in and say hi real quick and introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm Amanda Humphrey. I'm from Northeastern University.
I am Kari Teacher from the Institute for Systems Biology.
Okay, next slide, please. Here's just an overview of our agenda. As we usually do, we're going to provide updates on some ongoing discussions and some ongoing projects, and also pose some questions and polls around some potential emerging issues. And so our first agenda item here, of a big announcement, everyone. We're going to very soon be putting out a call for a new co-chair to join our team to replace Amanda Humphrey,
a condition that can't be satisfied. So I have to change my proposal type here. There's all of those validations are not built in. So you
Okay, all right, we good? Okay, so as I was saying, we are soon going to be putting out a call to have someone come on board and replace Amanda Humphrey as one of the Subawards Subcommittee co-chairs. And this is, bittersweet news, but we're going to save all of our emotions for the May FDP meeting, when we're going to do a more fitting and proper send-off for Amanda as we pass the torch to a new co-chair. But I did want to say a couple things about Amanda right before we send out this call for her replacement, because one thing, I'm hesitant to even use the word replace, because as many of you know, Amanda has been deeply involved in everything this subcommittee's done for quite some time now, and she's also been involved elsewhere at FDP. Many of you had a chance to work with her, and even when I say involved, like, that's an understatement, because Amanda doesn't just get involved in things. She really moves the needle. She's an incredibly hardworking, well-organized, and helpful colleague to us all. And in a collaborative environment like FDP, she's a great facilitator, but she's also a really strong leader. We all pitch in and contribute in this collaborative environment, but there are a few of us, few people that actually lead the way and get things moving. And Amanda is certainly one of those people, and has been for quite some time. And on top of that, she's wonderful to work with. So Kari and I are gonna eventually, when we bring someone else on in May, we're gonna miss Amanda for sure, but we're also excited about the opportunity to bring someone new onto the team and keep things in the subawards world moving along. So this slide, and I can give Amanda a chance to weigh in if she had any thoughts to add, but these are the basic responsibilities of the Subawards Subcommittee co-chair position. And organizing this meeting, but also monitoring working group activities, keeping your finger on the pulse of emerging issues, and just trying to help build and reinforce consensus and reduce administrative burden in the subawards world. That's what our work is all about. We have a good balance of ongoing and recurring projects that provide useful tools to the subawards community. And then, the opportunity to just address emerging issues and help clarify and mediate when FDP member institutions have questions. So it's a pretty exciting role. Can we go to the next slide, please? I don't know, Amanda, do you want to make a pitch for people to apply as your replacement or join our team, or add any particular thoughts about just some perspective from your position as a co-chair?
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for saying all that. That's very sweet of you. And I'm gonna miss you and Kari too. I think what is really exciting about this is, Kevin talked a little bit about leadership skills, and I think being part of the subboard subcommittee, I learned a lot about leadership, and I think it was incredibly helpful to my career serving in this capacity. So I would definitely recommend that people sign up or apply to be a co-chair. It's a great opportunity to connect with institutions across the country. You learn a lot from your colleagues, and it's a really interesting opportunity because you often end up touching things or getting involved with things that you had never really thought about before, and then you kind of like end up being an expert on them. So it's a lot of fun, and it's a great learning experience, and um, I've really enjoyed it, and I love it. So I really am excited for somebody new to get to take on this opportunity.
And so we will be posting all the details and instructions via the listserv very shortly, but don't hesitate to reach out directly to Amanda, Kari, or I if you have any questions or if you want to talk more about this potential opportunity. And like I said earlier, we'll do something in May. We'll try and do something a little bit more fitting for Amanda to recognize her contribution. So get your stories and anecdotes ready to share so we can send her up in May. And with that, let's get down to business, and I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda to start talking about FAFATA.
Thank you. So I just wanted to follow up on FAFATA. As everyone knows, Stephanie Scott and I worked on a relatively brief survey of FAFATA reporting practices, and we put that out this fall. We got 90 responses, which for a survey that was up for less than a month, that was a pretty great response rate. The data has been reviewed at a high level by the executive committee, and then we went ahead and sent it forward to our colleagues in OMB. Just to take a step back quickly and reframe, our colleagues in OMB are currently working on a project to better understand data flow, in particular, what's happening with FAFATA reporting. It's actually a part of the compliance supplement for this coming year. So it was a great time to check in about FAFATA reporting since we've all been doing it for several years. And now that the federal agencies are going to be taking a look at it through the compliance supplement, seems like a really good opportunity to put our voice out there to talk a little bit about our experiences with FAFATA reporting. And so that has been sent forward to OMB, and then we will be performing an analysis and summary, and then hopefully providing that to the community by May, if not before that time. Next slide, please. The other thing that we've been working on is a collaboration with our colleagues in finance, audit, and costing. And we'd often heard a little bit about subrecipient invoicing processes being sometimes challenging. And of course, that was a conversation that doesn't just impact the subaward process, it also and so we did some listening sessions with our colleagues, and we had really high level of engagement. In our first session, we had 231 attendees, and in the second session, we had 134 attendees. The discussion raised a lot of really interesting points and insights that we have started to discuss amongst ourselves, and then thinking about what the next steps for FDP could and should be. And so some of the discussion that we've had is that a next step might be a work group on invoice review standards, maybe like a checklist or something that institutions could have, like a standard expectation of, this is how somebody is supposed to review an invoice. This is what they should be looking for. And that could also help with the preparation of invoices, because if you know what people are going to be looking for when they receive an invoice, you might have a better sense of what to put into that invoice as you're preparing it. We've also talked about it, and I think Research Administration Committee and in particular the expanded clearinghouse subcommittee talked about some potential streamlining or discussion that we can do with them. And one of the areas that we've raised is potentially just some of the contact information for invoices, for audit, etc. And then updating existing subaward invoices like our invoice template and making sure that we update and harmonize with any new documentation that might arise if there is a product that comes out of or like an invoice review standard. And then just further engagement with the community may be needed, perhaps via survey, so that we have some data that we can quantify and put into report to support our analysis. So the first step for us will probably be pulling together a formal request to go to the executive committee to form a work group to start pulling together some sort of an invoice review standard or checklist that we could provide to the community. And then some of these other discussions have already started with the expanded clearinghouse. And then, we routinely review our subaward resources in light of other resources that we've created. So hopefully we'd be able to wrap that, the third bullet up into that. Next slide, please. Okay.
So we recently started receiving some questions about EO 14042, which is the executive order on ensuring adequate COVID safety protocols for federal contractors. And it requires executive agencies to include a clause in certain federal contracts and contract-like instruments that will require contractors and subcontractors to comply with various COVID-19 safety measures as set forth by the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force. Last September, the task force issued details on broad vaccine requirements for faculty, staff, and students working on covered contracts. While Section 5 of the executive order indicated it doesn't apply to grants, the task force guidance to date has been silent on this matter, but did note certain cooperative agreements would be included. The executive order tasks the FAR Council with developing a clause and to start taking initial steps to implement policy direction to acquisition offices for use of the clause. And also note the new FAR deviation clause 52.223-99 addresses subcontracts in Part D, and it directs the contractor to flow down the substance of this clause to contracts at any tier that exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold. And to be clear, inserting the clause into contracts below the simplified acquisition threshold isn't a requirement. And how agencies interpret this will likely be included in agency deviation memos, guidance, and webinars. I think we heard some agencies discussing this a little bit yesterday. And more information about this can be found in the task force guidance. At this time, we don't plan to modify the FTP templates since the executive order doesn't extend to grants. As for subcontracts, our sample is generic enough that it can be inserted as needed in the list of FAR clauses in attachment 6 if the contract or subcontract exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold. And as we know, litigation with federal courts delayed implementation, but we'll communicate any guidance necessary via the listserv with how this proceeds, and probably later this month or beginning of next month. Next slide, please. I will turn it over to Chris.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris McNitt. I am the Data Use Agreement Coordinator and Negotiator at Penn State University. I am one of the new co-chairs of the DTUA working group. Diana, my co-chair, was unfortunately unable to attend today. Diana Beglin is a Grants and Contracts Manager at the University of Chicago. Together, we are chairing a great group of about 30 or so individuals in the DTUA working group. As the co-chairs of the DTUA working group, we have been asked to serve in an advisory role for attachment 7 of the subaward. Since taking on this role, I have proposed some additional language changes in Attachment 7 to further align some of the subaward terms in Attachment 7 with the DTUA terms. In doing so, I worked very closely with our general counsel, who has an extensive background in data use and data transfers, not only as general counsel, but also fortunately as a researcher. With these additional proposed terms, our goal is to expand the acceptance of the use of the subaward DTUA Attachment 7. For example, Penn State right now is not authorized by our general counsel to accept or use Attachment 7. And these changes that we are proposing to pull in additional language directly from the FDP DTUA would allow us to have the full support and acceptance of use from our general counsel moving forward. Next slide, please. So how will we communicate these proposed changes? We will be sending out an email to the subawards listserv. There will be some additional changes to the first page as well of Attachment 7. For example, making the description of the data required and providing additional help text on what information should be entered into that section. In this email, we'll also show a comparison of the current Attachment 7 along with the redlined version that will provide the justification of the proposed changes. We're even going to point out the articles of the FDP DTUA in which the language is pulled from. A screenshot of that was on that previous slide. We don't need to go back though. The email will also include a short survey and an opportunity to provide feedback. This survey will ask for if the proposed changes will affect your institution's ability to utilize Attachment 7. Will it increase, decrease, or have no change in acceptability at your institution? Again, you will also be able to provide feedback, so feel free to provide anything additional at that time. The proposed timeline for circulating that email is hopefully by the end of January. We hope to gather the feedback during February and analyze the results, and hopefully provide a decision on the changes in March. Amanda, do you have anything additional to add?
No, that was a fantastic summary. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. If we could launch this first poll, switching topics and moving on to the potentially emerging topic of subawards with no IDC. So we're going to launch the poll here shortly, but just think about before you answer what we're referring to here, either as a pass-through entity or as a subrecipient. Have you seen awards, subawards under federal grants in which the prime award has full IDC and the subaward has limited or zero IDC? So we're not referring to the use of a de minimis IDC rate, which most of us don't have to worry about because we have negotiated rates with federal awarding agencies. We're not referring to like KL2 awards from NIH that are limited to 8% IDC for everyone. We're talking about you have a grant with a full IDC and you're turning around and issuing subawards at zero IDC. So in the past year, have you seen these? Yes, no, not sure. And as soon as it looks like we have critical mass, we can show the results here.
%65% have voted. Should we stop it, Kevin?
Give it another like 30 seconds.
Okay.
And once we get the poll results, we're gonna give people the opportunity on the next slide. There's some open-ended questions. If people want to chime in via the chat or unmute themselves and talk, we're looking for your thoughts, your objections, examples, or any insights you might have on these types of subawards. So sure, if we could publish the poll now, and we can move on to the next slide as well. Okay. Okay, so about a third of people are seeing them. And again, we asked this question for most of the pass-through entity and the subrecipient perspective. So not a very strong trend yet, but this comes up because we have started getting questions from members objecting to seeing these subawards, or at least getting into at the subaward stage some back and forth and some negotiation and some pushback. So we acknowledge that this is not necessarily limited to a subawards issue, because a lot of this stuff is being addressed at proposal stage or when people submit letters of intent. But I can say that at my institution, we do, in some cases, issue what we call pilot awards. It's where the cooperative agreement has a grant making or pilot component to it with a to be determined subrecipient pool and a to be determined number of subrecipients. But even I don't know the full details and decision making and authorities behind some of those pilot subawards going out, but they're usually small dollar value subawards, 25,000 direct, 50,000 direct, for very limited, smaller statements of work, usually no more than a year, things like that. So that's what I'm seeing from my perspective, but wanted to see if anyone could share their thoughts on this issue. And so can take a look at the chat, see what other people are saying.
Do you want me to, I read some of the comments,
Sure.
Kevin, and we did get 2 comments that were basically, they've issued $0 subawards when requested by the subrecipient, and that might be because the subrecipient is a nonprofit entity. Perhaps they don't have a rate agreement and I'm guessing they probably don't understand how that they could get the de minimis, but or maybe they just don't think that they need the overhead. It's built into what they propose as part of their budget. So those comments were in there.
Yeah, that's yeah, I kind of wasn't even thinking about that. But that would be an interesting point to clarify, that you do have situations like that. But I guess I'm more thinking about subawards to each other, to other FDP institutions, that upon receiving a subaward with 0 IDC, regardless of the dollar value in direct costs, saying we have a federally negotiated IDC rate here and your prime award has full IDC, you know, what gives? Even if we did agree to it at proposal stage, I think maybe something the FDP and Subawards Subcommittee can do here is try and provide a little bit of clarity on the process, and in particular, are we doing this the right way? Like, if we are issuing these pilot subawards with 0 IDC, it may be just fine, but are we doing it the right way with the necessary approvals and not sort of blindsiding or not giving our fellow subrecipients the chance to really review this? Because I'm wondering if, you know, for example, like, is there anyone out there as a subrecipient that would not accept an award like this?
And in the comments, we've gotten a few additional comments saying, you know, we've received reduced IDC on broader NIH funded clinical networks, which is either a tier system or an average of all the subrecipients' IDCs. Then another commenter posted, we've had a situation where the prime awardee of a multi-site averaged the F&A of the sub-sites, and then we had to accept a lower rate than our federally negotiated rate. And I think that's really interesting, because there's obviously a methodology there where you know, you've got a clinical trial and it's impossible to appropriately make payments to all of your clinical trial sites without doing perhaps some sort of an averaging there. But there's at least a kind of clearly disclosed methodology that is somehow based on somebody's your IDC rate through a certain lens, even if it's averaged with others, as opposed to maybe a PTE. I think, Kevin, what you might be talking about as well is, you know, PTE unilaterally making a decision to say, yes, we've gotten the IDC at our federally negotiated rate. Now we're just going to go ahead and issue this subaward with maybe our overhead rate, even if it's not what the subrecipient receives.
Yeah, so thanks. These comments are great because they're kind of highlighting a lot of different scenarios that I didn't necessarily have in mind. So this is very helpful. And there's also the scale of averaging IDC. That's a really interesting concept. Limiting IDC to something in between your negotiated rate and zero, which it would involve some sort of calculation. And then there's also just zero. And yeah, I just am curious. I don't know if anyone can weigh in now or contact us afterwards if you've had conversations with federal awarding agencies about this. Like if you're the recipient of a cooperative agreement that has a pilot grant component to it, was this explicitly stated in the funding opportunity announcement? Is it somewhere? Is it somewhere in writing? Was there like documented approval? I don't have the reference off the top of my head, Amanda, and Kari and I were looking for this, but somewhere I believe when it comes to NIH in particular, that it's explicit, like at what level of NIH you need approval to deviate from a federally negotiated indirect cost rate. I know there's someone in our subawards community that knows this reference because they pointed it out when they brought it up during a phone call, and we've just like searched our notes and emails for this and cannot find it. So, you know, we don't have to, you know, right now if people aren't prepared to provide examples, but we'd be just really interested in hearing like any challenges or success stories and having these conversations with federal awarding agencies themselves.
And Kevin, there were two more comments that came through that I just wanted to flag because I think they're really interesting and new ones that I had not heard of. One is there's an issue where the USDA NIFA is a prime because their rules put a limit on IDC that must include the F&A of the subs and the prime. So it sounds like it's kind of a permutation on that averaging that we were hearing about from the clinical trials. And then, but maybe people don't average, maybe they just use some other formula. And then there's another one here that says, I wonder about are the federal flow through from state agencies that aren't clear on the fund source and want a state rate or something unique. Oh, and then there's a new one that says we've issued pilots off of spores and other cooperative awards where the pilots included but limited to total cost. We've issued with 0% F&A to maximize the pilot funding, again, for 25K to 50K small awards.
Yeah, so these comments are great. And I think we can kind of leave it at, you know, we'll keep an eye out. But again, some people did reach out to us and they did say like, you know, their inclination was that we shouldn't be doing this. And so I guess from the subaward subcommittee position, and we can talk to our colleagues elsewhere at FDP, maybe we can add a frequently asked question to our current FAQs, and we can try and clarify these different scenarios for when you see this in subawards. But yeah, it looks like this word pilot keeps on coming up, so we can do a little bit more digging to see if we can reference either NIH policies or uniform guidance or other types of documentation, citations directly from the federal agencies themselves to provide some backup, because I can see a lot of situations where it would be totally legit to issue for 25K, 50K direct cost pilots under certain types of cooperative agreements. It's just a matter of providing clarity and consistency, especially when we issue subawards to one another, to other FDP member institutions.
And then we got a really great comment that might be useful for the FAQ. We have some of the clinical trials with reduced IDC and the pilots with no IDC. We usually accept if there's a written policy that is in place for all the sites and the federal agency has approved it. We do see and then with respect to pilots and the no IDC. We do see this as acceptable for small dollar awards because they want as much to go to the pilot project as possible, and those seem relatively infrequent.
All right, thanks again, everyone, for these comments. These are really helpful. All right, so I think we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so Amanda is going to provide some historical background on this discussion, which we've had in years past on the subaward subcommittee. But on the heels of the subaward delays survey, there were some comments that people provided about kind of asking for, you know, a little more automation or integration, systems integration, auto-populating of templates. You know, the subaward templates and mods themselves have reduced a lot of administrative burden, but this concept of system integration, system template integration might be the next step in reducing admin burden. So I wanted to, and we've also received inquiries independent of the subaward delays survey from some new phase 7 members asking about, would we make the templates available in different file formats specifically for some systems integration experiments that institutions are running. So I'll turn it over to Amanda for some background, and then we'll come back to maybe a way forward on this issue as well.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Next slide, please. So we, you know, just to give the historical context in particular for our phase 7 members that maybe didn't have an opportunity to be part of the discussion in prior phases, some of these decisions were made in phase 6 and earlier. You know, at one point, what we actually had was a Word document with a PDF of attachments 3A and 3B, and everything else was a Word document. And we found that a lot of people were going in there and slipping additional terms and conditions or changing words. And then also we had, and those were rare cases, but they did happen. And then we also found that it was difficult to integrate the PDF and the Word document together into one document. And so we started playing around with the template and talking to users, and we found that we could actually build a single file PDF with menus that would auto-populate and fill rather than having, like, we used to have a list of separate attachment twos by federal agency. And so there was one with like an NIH header, an NSF header, and Department of Defense, et cetera. And instead of managing all of those different attachments, twos, and other file parts, we merged it all into an Adobe where when you selected the funding agency up top, it would actually change the relevant terms and conditions throughout the document, and also did some other auto population features throughout the document. And that made it a little bit easier because it enabled more security than, you know, that the document had not been altered, and it was easier to identify specific terms and conditions that had been added. It was also easier to look through the document and look for where terms and conditions would need to be selected and would maybe drive a little bit more intensive review, like understanding, okay, so do I need to have my financial, do they indicate financial contact somewhere, et cetera. And then it was also for the consistency of layout so that people knew where to find things and how the document was to be organized. So it did allow us at that time to hopefully streamline the very manual nature of pulling together an FDP subaward and made it, I hope, a little bit less burdensome. And it also, though, proposed like a new thing that we had to deal with, which is that it was a significant burden to maintain both Word and Adobe versions of all of these different templates that we have. So we ended up making a decision that since most institutions were relying on the Adobe template, and we at the time had, you know, a couple of institutions that were using auto-populated templates, that, you know, we were just gonna stop maintaining a Word version of all of the templates and instead those institutions could convert the PDF to Word, and that was part of the reason we provided the major changes document, as well as the crosswalk, was to help facilitate maintenance of the templates for the small number of institutions that were auto-populating their templates in some form or fashion, and help them to be able to use that, use those documents to facilitate inputting and maintenance of those documents. And so now we come to the current point in time, and I will turn it back over to Kevin.
Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, what has changed since the previous discussions? So taking some of the, again, the subaward delays survey feedback that we saw people asking for, or at least inquiring about systems integration. Personally, I feel like the future will hold increased template system integration, more automation. And so maybe I'm certainly not volunteering our template working group for extra work, or to shoulder that burden that Amanda was just talking about of maintaining all these extra templates and file formats. But this might be something we pay attention to going forward, if it seems like institutions are starting to explore things like this. We'd also be interested to hear from anyone. We could, carve out some time in the agenda at the May or September meeting if someone would like to demonstrate what they're doing at their institution, if they have any success stories in this area, or efficiency gains by being able to integrate the current templates into their systems, auto-populate data, so forth. And we've also received questions, like Amanda was getting at, whether or not, even if you're not changing the terms and conditions, if you're changing the appearance of the template, whether or not that constitutes a significant change that would warrant removing the FTP moniker, because there's some risk associated with templates looking differently, because it just might invite some confusion. It might invite some pushback, even if the substance is largely unchanged. So this is something else that we would want to pay attention to as if institutions start to roll this out. And yeah, I mean, as we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, we're going to be revisiting the templates as part of our normal cycle anyway, later this year. So, okay, some comments coming in.
This is really interesting. There was one interesting comment. The current templates are great, except the drop downs and autofill stop working when you update to include additional attachments such as scope, budget, PTE, award. Usually what we do is we recommend running the template after you have put in all of those pieces of information. If you're talking about inserting additional pages for the PTE award, that's definitely something we recommend doing right at the very end, just because once you run the template, any new pages that you insert in there will a little bit change the way the code runs for and maybe if Stephanie Stone is here, if there's anything you wanted to add to that, please feel free to unmute yourself. There's another one that says we have a custom PeopleSoft bolt-on that completes a majority of the PDF template when the agreement is generated. It's a really interesting way of using PeopleSoft, and I find that very interesting. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then another, we use Adobe Sign, which the current template has glitches on some pull-down screens, making it incompatible or receive errors when trying to sign. Again, Stephanie, if you're here and you have any guidance on that, please feel free, because we've got another individual chiming in and kind of seconding that.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Adobe Sign is a whole thing. That's a whole technical thing, right? That has proven to be difficult. That what you basically want to do with that is get your entire template ready to go and flatten it, then put it through Adobe Sign. if you really want to use it. But I personally haven't had problems with attaching documents to the template if you're still sort of in the drafting process.
And one thing I would just add to that is one of the first things that I usually say to users is make sure you've downloaded the PDF and you're not trying to insert those pages and working in the browser itself, because that can add some layers of complication.
Right. And I have seen some people, if they look at the template on their phone or some sort of mobile device, it does get a little weird looking, but when you're actually back at your computer, laptop, desktop, it looks normal. So you might just be thrown off by some sort of mobile view.
And then there's just a question, is FDP looking into creating a Docusign process for the FDP templates? We have not discussed a route like that. I know that even electronic signatures can be hit or miss depending on the institution. Different institutions are in different places with that. So we haven't really discussed having like a formal DocuSign process for the templates, but it's certainly something that we could collect some degree of feedback on. I don't know how institution specific that needs to be in terms of licenses and things like that.
Yeah, I can say as an institution that uses DocuSign for pretty much all of our subawards, there's there's a huge payoff on our end. There's huge benefits to it, but we use it just to circulate, like Stephanie said, the flattened final version where we're asking the subrecipient to do no more than really just sign it. But yeah, it doesn't work all the time. We get pushback. Occasionally people pull the documents outside of DocuSign and email it back to us. Some people don't still have different digital signature parameters for what they can accept, and different processes for how they route subawards for review, where at their institution where DocuSign might get a little bit cumbersome. So I understand, even though I'm a DocuSign supporter and user, I understand some of the objections that people have from time to time about the process. But yeah, these Adobe Sign, DocuSign type stuff, this is like the intermediate, like between full on like systems integration and just using email, is kind of just using digital signature tools, which is kind of like, in between. But we can go ahead and throw that in the conversation. Even at things like Adobe Sign and DocuSign, we should, at least pay attention to if we can provide some best practices on how to make the process go as smoothly as possible. So we have a poll here as well. So if we want to go to the next slide, and we're going to ask you to kind of weigh in on the spectrum of, yes, we're high tech and we've implemented full-on systems integration and we're approaching the singularity at our institution, to all the way to we're keeping it old school and we're just going to email PDFs and populate them manually. So there's kind of 5 different options here. So if we could launch the poll and just take a second to just let us know how far along, if at all, you are when it comes to integrating templates with your systems of record at your home institutions. All right, we can probably publish this poll as whenever we're upwards of 60, 70% or so.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. So I have a feeling this is sort of, this topic is sort of feeling like the other topic of the $0 IDC subawards, where it's like, it's emerging, but it's, still pretty anecdotal at this point. But in either of those regards, template systems integration or zero IDC subawards under federal grants, just keep an eye out. Contact us, subawards@thefdp.org, and we'll follow this and see if it's worth evolving into a working group or further discussions. But thanks a lot to everyone for your comments. And we have a couple more slides and topics to go to, so I'll turn it over to Kari.
Thank you, Kevin and Amanda. So if you're unfamiliar with FFRDC, it stands for Federally Funded Research and Development Centers. FFRDCs are a special type of government-owned, contractor-operated research centers that conduct research and development in support of a federal agency's mission. FFRDCs are intended to provide federal agencies with R&D capabilities that can't be effectively met by the federal government or by the private sector alone. So they operate under the framework of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and currently 13 federal agencies, such as the DOE, DOT, and NSF, sponsor or co-sponsor a total of 42 FFRDCs. FFRDCs are allowed to perform work for other agencies when the capabilities of the FFRDC aren't available in the private sector. And in these cases, you may run across projects that utilize their services. Funding for this work isn't normally included in a prime award. The federal agency would fund the FFRDC directly, and federal solicitations usually specify this arrangement, and the FFRDC would obtain an authorization from the cognizant contracting officer of the federal agency sponsoring the FFRDC, such as the DOE, to authorize its participation in the proposed project. And this authorization is submitted with the application. So it's just sort of like a little background. Occasionally, a federal solicitation may require the FFRDC to act as a subrecipient. However, that's not the norm, and that's kind of where we come in this discussion. Although the relationship of a FFRDC may be considered by the nature of the work to be that of a subrecipient, FFRDCs aren't usually permitted to accept subawards from non-federal entities, and likewise aren't permitted to accept specific flow down requirements. And I'm sure maybe some of you have seen this, and as a community, we've seen instances where a sponsoring federal agency funds a FFRDC as a subrecipient, even though the solicitation states differently. And this has proven to be a challenge for many institutions, but we found that there are solutions, such as a strategic partnership projects agreement. And if you're comfortable sharing your experience with FFRDCs, we'd be interested to hear from you. You can put your thoughts in the chat or follow up with us afterwards. I'll just wait a few minutes to see if anyone has any comments. I'm not seeing any comments right now, so let's move on to the next slide, please. So in the fall of this year, our templates will undergo regular maintenance. I think Kevin touched upon this a little bit earlier. And as you know, the guidance documents were recently updated in March of 2021. So RAC, CAT, FQ, there's a lot of activity. It's a really fun working group. It has two subgroups working in parallel. One is a profile subgroup and the other is a monitoring tool subgroup. The profile subgroup is working on reviewing, editing, and commenting on the 2019 financial questionnaire, which was drafted by the FTP Expanded Clearinghouse Committee Working Group to identify updates needed for compliance with current UG requirements, etc. And it's also reviewing, editing, and commenting on the current entity profile in the Expanded Clearinghouse to create a recommended draft profile for use by the non-single audit entities. The second group is the monitoring tools subgroup, and it's working on a survey to gather information on the FTP monitoring tools that will be, the survey will be sent to the research administration community once we're finished. And the survey is really just to determine the priorities of this subgroup. And Cook MOU. So last year, we asked the community to send us their thoughts about the MOU guidance and templates, and we got a lot of responses. Thank you so much. Those shared thoughts, along with the case studies that were sent and different scenarios, have been reviewed and were sent to the executive committee for approval. I'm seeing a comment actually about FFRDCs. We have found FFRDCs to be incredibly difficult to work with from proposal through account management. Every step is more difficult. Thank you. That's kind of the impression that we've got as well. Let's see, some national labs have 501c3 set up in order to funnel those funds through. We just submitted a proposal with Los Alamos National Lab as a sub, but the nonprofit was the entity. Let's see. Listed as the sub, the nonprofit will have an agreement with LANL to get the funding to the National Lab PI. Wow, thank you so much for these comments. These are really helpful. We'll go through these and provide some information to the listserv if it becomes more pressing. Thank you so much, guys. So next slide, please. And last but not least, friendly reminder about changes. The templates were created to make things easier and to reduce administrative burden. So let us know if you get one with changes, and we'll gently contact the institution. When we do, it's always a really lovely conversation. It's very friendly. We learn a lot, and sometimes there are reasons for it. And we just want to encourage you to let us know. Our friends in the Expanded Clearinghouse talked about this earlier, and I think just as a group, we're paying close attention to it. But thank you for reaching out to us about it.
We had a great comment. David Mayo said, Kari, if you have time, I might have some FFRDC comments easier and more quickly provided verbally. And we've had a lot of engagement over chat. So maybe since we do have a few minutes, we can open up the floor and go back to FFRDCs. David, do you want to kick us off by unmuting yourself and letting us know what you got?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So Caltech operates an FFRDC. It's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So we're the federal contractor. We operate them. They do business as California Institute of Technology, DBA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And most of the federal labs are operated by a nonprofit. So when you issue a sub to a lab, you're not issuing it to the lab, you're issuing it to the nonprofit that operates the lab, even though you're working with the lab, but they're probably a completely separate facility. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize, including most of the scientists at labs, is that they're not there to do independent research. They're there to only work under that lab's prime contract with DOE or NASA. So they're often working jointly with researchers at the institution that operates them. So for Caltech, that's, we've got JPL scientists, Caltech researchers working together, and they want to play the same way Caltech researchers are playing, but they can't. The labs are not allowed to accept money outside of their prime contract without getting permission from their prime agency to do so. So there's a huge number of hurdles they have to go through if they want to engage. And a lot of times it's their scientist who wants to engage, and they've never even bothered to let their management know that they want to do this. So the advance, I saw a comment about the advance payment requirement and how painful that is. And yet it shouldn't really be an issue for you if you're flowing money down to them, because you have the authority to do that under your federal prime. And they can't work in arrears because they're not allowed to put government money. They're not allowed to use government money to front non-prime contract operations. That's why they have to do that, if that makes sense. And by prime contract, I mean their prime operating contract. So in the situations where they can't accept your flow down terms, which are to us normal with all of our relationships for subrecipient, what I've had success with is going back to my prime agency, NSF, DOE, whoever it might be, and asking them for permission to set aside the flow down terms in favor of letting the FFRDC's prime contract terms for management of, all the compliance issues supersede. I can guarantee you that the terms in their prime operating contract are 10 times more burdensome than any flow downs you will have. And they're almost all the same terms anyway. Anything that's federally required from a compliance point of view is 10 times more burdensome in their contract than it is for you under a grant. So, and most federal grants officers will recognize that. Oh, you're issuing a sub to Lawrence Livermore. No problem. Let flow down your sub, but make your sub's terms, let the FFRDC's terms of their prime operating contract supersede yours to the extent that there is any conflict. That usually makes them happy because they have to follow the terms of their prime. They can't accept your flow down terms. Now, things about indemnification and payment terms and so forth, those are individual to the relationship that you're establishing. But you kind of have to understand where they're coming from. They have no choice. But you
David,
do.
One question I have is you gave some really great feedback, and a lot of those comments that we're envisioning the relationship as being the FFRDC as the subrecipient. What guidance would you have if the FFRDC is actually the prime and the academic institution is the subrecipient, and so the FFRDC is providing a lot of additional requirements that are burdensome. I think one of the ones we saw in there was a requirement for backup for how all the math was done in the proposal, and some other pieces of what you were talking about, like including indemnification requirements in their template. So do you have any insights on that aspect?
Not really, because now you're just dealing with an entity flowing down federal funding. They're not, if I heard you correctly, they're the pass-through entity in your scenario.
Yeah.
But where are they getting their money from? Is it from their prime contract or is it from some other grant? You see what I mean?
Usually like in some cases that I've experienced, it's one or the other. I've seen both ways of doing it.
I think you're really going to have to treat them like you would a for-profit and a for-profit passing through federal money, because that's how they act. They're costing, they don't negotiate an indirect cost rate. They follow the commercial model. In fact, their cost principles are basically 31.2 the FAR versus the uniform guidance. Okay, so they're following that model. Right or wrong, for your purposes as their sub, you're going to have to deal with them in a sense the same way you would a commercial prime. I mean, a commercial sponsor flowing down federal money, because that's the way they think. At least that's the way their subcontracts office thinks, because that's who they're mostly dealing with, is commercial entities.
It's really interesting. I did not know that. David, is there someone maybe at your institution? I know that you're super busy. Maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody else that directly at the FFRDC, Caltech, the Jet Propulsion Lab, that maybe we could have a follow-up conversation with and like learn a little bit more and hear some more information. Maybe I can connect with you after the webinar and get.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I'm happy to participate in that discussion. Keep in mind, I'm not speaking on behalf of JPL. I'm speaking on behalf of Caltech as a university. Most people at JPL would have no idea what I just said. Because when we receive money from JPL, it's an intra-system transfer of funds because we operate them. We're the same legal entity. We can't issue subawards to one another because we are Caltech. We're both Caltech. So they're just a division of Caltech. I would assume the same is similar for MIT and Lincoln Lab, for example.
Okay.
But I'm happy to participate in discussion or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, we've actually had a fair amount of interest and support in the chat for a committee-sponsored webinar on working with FFRDCs. And maybe pulling in some individuals from FFRDCs and having that. So I think that could be a really interesting thing. Does anyone else want to unmute yourself and share some feedback or information that you have about FFRDCs? We did have a comment also in the chat saying, is it possible to put together a list of best practices for working with FFRDCs? I think that's a really interesting idea.
There are some common principles which I mentioned, but also each FFRDC has a different prime contract. And depending on what era, and by era I mean decade, that prime contract started. Did it start before the Cold War, during the Cold War, or after the Cold War, actually influences the way that entity works. I don't know that from personal experience. I haven't been around that long, but I've heard actual labs. In fact, the University of California, I used to work at UC, the University of California used to operate 3 separate labs, Livermore, Lawrence Berkeley, and Los Alamos. They're now a partner with Los Alamos, but still operate the other 2. But each lab was put in place at a different time in history. And the nature of the work they did colored and the influence of the political environment actually impacted the types of terms and environment that they still operate in under their prime contract. So even that can change. And of course, you've got DOE versus NASA versus DOD as the sponsor of the lab.
Somebody mentioned in the chat, David brings up a good point. We've had a 70-year relationship with Oak Ridge National Lab, and their requirements are very different from other FFRDCs. So it's really interesting to hear how the political environment that they started under has impacted the way in which they operate. And then somebody added into the chat, there is an FFRDC list available online with a complete listing of the FFRDCs and their administrators. I think it appears to be hosted by NSF. So if anyone's looking for that, definitely check out the chat box.
Hi, this is Jen from OHSU. I'm logged in under Lisa because she couldn't make it. We've recently had some issues because with an NIH contract that was incoming to us, trying to sub out to a DOE lab, the contracts officer at NIH said that the flow through has to go, like it has to flow through. So those FARs, regardless of whether they conflict with the DOE operating agreement or not, if they couldn't accept them, they could not be a sub. So that obviously got pretty messy, but because the DOE lab can't violate their operating terms. And so we ended up having to do a side-by-side of making sure that the DOE operating agreement covered everything, which it was close, but not exact. And the other issue we've been having recently is this same lab not wanting to accept an end date on agreements, which with a sponsored project, that's impossible because you have to close out. So I don't know if anybody else has been experiencing that, but that's been a pretty recent challenge.
There was a follow-up question on what's the logic on no end date?
So the logic they're providing is that they can't have a hard end date because they have to wait until.
Oh, you just cut out or went back on mute. That happened to me earlier.
Okay, so they, thank you. They want to be able to bill after the fact if it turns out that they spent more than they billed for.
Well, these have all been like really great comments and questions. This seems like this is something that the community is really interested in. And I think, you know, after the meeting, we'll probably discuss and come up with some more guidance. And at least, David, I think you gave us all a good idea of the types of questions that we should ask, even if there's not standard language or standard practices for each FFRDC. I think a lot of us now know like what to ask and at least what's possible, but that we all share similar pain points. But thank you so much for jumping in there and explaining it. I feel like I learned so much from all of this and everyone's comments too. Yeah, so you know, if you want to email us, I think the very last slide that we have to present, if we want to go back to that, has our contact information. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll continue to look into this. And the email address there goes to all of the co-chairs. And is there anything else that you want to say, Amanda or Kevin, before we close out?
Yeah, I just on this slide in particular, I just wanted to add that like we do our best to get back to everyone, and some questions require us to kind of talk amongst ourselves or do more research. Some are pretty simple answers, and then some are just like, wow, this is a meeting topic that we should start putting on the agenda. So apologies if we or I like didn't get back to all the questions that you sent to this inbox. We do our best, but one idea that we had was to take some of these questions that we receive and you know, anonymize them and make it so, you know, not using names of individuals or institutions, but present, you know, mini case studies of some questions that we're getting, because there's a lot of interesting stuff that we see and we feel like we can turn it into just very specific, useful learning points for everyone in the community. So we might explore that if we have time on future agendas to kind of provide some insight into the type of questions that we receive during this, when we monitor this inbox. And yeah, and then I guess the last thing for us would be thanks, David Wright, for all your work. You've done a lot of great stuff for the Subawards Subcommittee and the rest of FDP. So we appreciate your hard work and wish you well. And also appreciate Moises and Sarah for helping us out this time around and going forward. So thanks, David.